At 3:17:11 UTC, the world did not feel it as one event. It felt it as 10. Prologue, the blip that shouldn't exist. I saw it first as a smear of numbers. Not the miracle videos, not the posts, not the breathless headlines that would come later when the story had already chosen its mythology. I saw it as a line in a log file that had no business being there. My lab sits behind 2 layers of doors and 1 layer of bureaucracy, inside a building that smells faintly of ozone and varnished wood. We pretend the smell is clean. It's not. It's the scent of electricity doing what it does best. Warming copper, aging insulation, leaving invisible fingerprints on every ambition we have for truth. My work, until that night, had been simple to describe and hard to do. I watched clocks. Not the kind people wear, but clocks that keep time by listening to atoms. Cesium fountains, strontium lattices, hydrogen masers, oscillators so vain about precision they need their own rooms, their own shock absorbers, their own climate control, their own little rituals of isolation. We watch them because time is a convenient liar. It drifts when the universe drifts. If a fundamental constant twitches, if the fine structure constant or the electron-to-proton mass ratio shifts by a hair, your best clocks will notice before your best philosophers do. A handful of us around the world belonged to a loose consortium whose name sounded like a startup and behaved like a monastery, the Kronos Network. The official grant language said we were searching for correlated transients consistent with exotic physics, which is how you ask for money without saying the words dark matter in front of people tired of funding invisibility. Privately, we told one another the romance, if an ultralight field passes through Earth, our clocks will sing. There were models, serious ones, topological defects, domain walls, solitons, things that could drift through the galaxy as calmly as dust motes, changing the values of the constants inside them, the way humidity changes the tuning of a violin. If one of those passed through Earth, it might do something like this. Clocks would nudge off their normal frequencies for milliseconds. Magnetometers might show a subtle synchronized tick. Optical cavities might breathe. Gravimeters might sigh. We had never seen it. We had seen glitches and blamed the human infrastructure that carries our data. Routers, firmware updates, old coaxial cables, cosmic rays smacking a bit at the wrong moment. Then, in the quiet hour between my second coffee and my third attempt at sleep, the alert system barked. A single event flagged across 7 nodes in 6 countries. A match filter that should almost never fire had fired hard. I leaned in, lips pressed tight in the posture of someone who expects to be disappointed. 3 časa I 17 minuti I 11 sekundi UTS. Amplitude, small but clean. Duration, 1.8 seconds in the clocks, longer in the magnetometers. Geometry, planar, consistent with a sweeping front, like the edge of a sheet cutting through Earth. And on top of it, like lace stitched into a wound, there was modulation. Not smooth, not natural, not the single hump predicted by any of our models. A pattern, short, short, long slash short, long, long, long slash pause. My first thought was not aliens. My first thought was profanity, because if this was real, it wasn't just physics. It was crafted. It was as though the universe had finally cleared its throat and chosen to speak in timing. I stared at the waveform until it became absurdly intimate, like a heartbeat on a monitor. Then my phone buzzed. A colleague, Anya, had sent a link with no greeting. Hospital chapel cross glowing in pulses, raw security footage attached. Timestamp matches your clock alert. I opened it, and that's when the story stopped being mine. 1. Christianity. The cross. Sister Marisol Reyes had learned to distrust spectacle the way some people learn to distrust sugar, by watching what it does to the body after the sweetness is gone. She was a nurse before she was a sister, and even after vows had stitched her into a different kind of mentionable life, the nurse remained, the one who knew the honest language of flesh. In the hospital chapel, miracles were usually small. a hand unclenching, a breath easing. The softening in a family's face when bargaining finally exhausted itself, and love, plain, unheroic love, had to take over. The crucifix above the altar was plain, almost apologetic, dark wood, a metal corpus that had been polished so often the contours had softened under human care. No jewels, no drama. Marisol had dusted it so many times she could have done it blind. That night she was alone, folding linens in the sacristy, when the cross answered a question she hadn't asked aloud. It did not flare like stage light. It did not dazzle. It pulsed, a hush of brightness in the grain of the wood, then darkness, then brightness again. Not random, measured. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. A pause that felt intentional, like a breath taken at the end of a prayer. She froze with a towel half folded, fingers arrested mid-crease. Her training reached for explanations. Faulty wiring, reflections from the corridor, the security light outside. But the chapel windows were black, and the hallway beyond the frosted glass was dim. The candles were steady, no flicker, no draft. The cross cast a shadow that did not match the flame. It stretched and contracted as if the air itself was obeying a second, invisible heartbeat. For a moment, Marisol felt what she had not allowed herself to feel since she'd watched a child die of something science had named, but could not stop. Powerlessness. Her knees found the floor before her mind approved the motion. "Speak," she whispered. Half command, half surrender. The pulses continued, steady as if they had been waiting centuries for someone to notice they were counting. And because she was human, because she had given her life to the idea of God, she did what humans always do with the incomprehensible. She named it holy. When she finally remembered she was a nurse in a modern building full of cameras, she stood and crossed herself with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. She checked the chapel's electrical panel. No surge, no outage, nothing. She opened the maintenance closet, found the old handheld EMF meter the hospital used to appease worried patients when the MRI ran. The meter registered a brief spike at the next pulse, barely above background, but there. Then something stranger. The spike wasn't broad noise. It was narrow, like a tone. A vibration in the air her body felt more than heard. Marisol looked up at the cross and did not know whether to weep or laugh. Above her, the symbol of sacrifice and love counted in light. Outside, an ambulance arrived. The hospital went on. Inside, something had chosen the chapel as if it understood what a chapel was for, a quiet place humans used to listen for meaning. 2. Islam, the Qur'an. Imam Karim. Al-Hassan had closed the mosque for the night, but the building never felt empty. Even alone, he moved as if seen, because to him the unseen was not metaphor. It was a condition of existence. He had returned to the prayer hall because sleep had refused him. There were nights when the mind kept turning like a worry stone, and the only answer was to sit near the words that had held generations upright. The Qur'an rested on its stand, wrapped and protected the way you protect something that is not merely paper and ink. Karim had taught children that respect is not superstition. It is attention given where it is due. When the first shimmer came, he thought it was fatigue, dry eyes, the after-image of a street lamp. But the light wasn't on the text itself. It gathered in the gilded margin, a thin halo that strengthened, softened, strengthened again. A rhythm, not a glow, not aesthetic. A sequence. He leaned closer, careful not to touch. The illumination rose and fell in crisp intervals, short brightenings, longer holds, pauses that landed exactly where a reciter might breathe. And then, beneath it, he felt something that made his skin go cold. Not a voice, not a whisper, but a pressure in the air, like sound stripped of language. As if the room itself was being used as an instrument. Kareem's first instinct was not fear. It was a kind of humility so fierce it hurt. If this is a sign, who am I to deserve it? Then skepticism, because his faith did not ask him to abandon reason. He checked the lights. Off. He checked the window shutters. Closed. He checked the HVAC vents. Still. He took out his phone and recorded without thinking. The camera captured what his eyes saw, but the audio captured something else, a low, pulsed thrum beneath the silence, so low it barely existed in the human range. The sequence continued. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Kareem bowed his head until his forehead nearly met the carpet. In his chest, the reflex arrived before thought. Mercy, warning, invitation, reminder. Outside, the city slept. Inside, the margins of the holy book counted in light, patient, exact, refusing to be dismissed as mere emotion. When the pulses ended, the hall felt suddenly colder, as if the air had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Kareem sat for a long time afterward, palms on his knees, unable to decide whether he had witnessed the nearness of God or the cleverness of something that knew how to borrow holiness like a cloak. 3. Hinduism, the Shiva Lingam. At the river temple, Pandit Anant Sharma had performed the same gestures so long his hands had grown wise without his permission. Oil lamp, bell, water, milk, flowers. The lingam, dark and smooth, held the touch of countless palms. It was not an idol to him. It was a focus, an axis where the ordinary world admitted it had limits. That night, during the final offering, something changed in the stone. At first, it was only condensation, beads forming where there should have been none. The temple was warm, the air heavy with incense. Yet the droplets gathered not as sweat gathers. They gathered as if guided. One bead, a pause. Two quick beads, a longer pause. A bead that formed and held, trembling but not falling. Anant froze mid-chant. The lingam surface began to thrum, not audibly but in the bone, a vibration that traveled up the wrist when he dared to touch the base. It wasn't like touching a machine. It felt alive in a different way, not organic, but resonant. The bell at the altar, untouched, gave a faint answering ring. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Anant had studied philosophy. He knew the stories. He knew the mind could hallucinate pattern under devotion. But the droplets, he could see them. The bell, he could hear it. The vibration, he could feel it in his teeth. He looked at the lingam as if seeing it for the first time, as if the stone were not merely stone but a boundary where something outside the world pressed its fingers against the glass. Mahadev, he breathed, voice breaking. If you are showing us something, let us have the courage to see. The droplets continued, deliberate as punctuation, not Sanskrit, not any human script, a language of timing that felt older than language. Later, when the temple attendants arrived, they found Anant sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the lingam with the wary expression of a man who has realized the difference between worship and listening. He did not tell them what he thought. He told them what he saw, and even that sounded impossible. 4. Buddhism, the prayer wheel. Tenzin Dorje had been told since childhood that the mind is a monkey, always reaching, always leaping, so he had learned to give it a task. He spun the prayer wheel gently at dawn, the mantras inside rolling like a river in a cylinder. Spin, breathe, spin, breathe. The world could do what it wanted. He would answer with steadiness. But before sunrise, the wheel began to move without him. At first he suspected wind. He looked to the temple doors, closed. The air was still. The incense smoke rose in a calm, vertical line. The wheel turned anyway, slowly at first, then with smooth acceleration that didn't match any gust or tremor. It stopped, held, then turned again in a new burst. Not continuous motion, patterned motion. Tenzin watched, breath deepening automatically. The wheel was not being possessed, it was being used. The cylinder's metal surface caught the lantern light in repeating flashes, quick glints, longer gleams, a pause like a breath withheld. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. He did not call it a god. He did not call it a demon. He called it what his teacher had taught him to call the strange and sudden, a phenomenon arising from causes and conditions. Still his palms pressed together, not in supplication, but in acknowledgement. If the universe was speaking, it was not speaking in stories. It was speaking in timing. After the pulses ended, the wheel slowed as gently as if a hand had released it. Tenzin placed his fingers on the metal. It was warm, not friction warm, but warm in patches, as if the heat itself had been patterned. His teacher, when told, did not smile. He only said, "If it is real, do not chase it. Let it come again. Truth does not mind repetition." 5. Judaism, the Ner Tamid. Rabbi Leah ben Ari had always loved the Ner Tamid most when it was unimpressive. Not the theatrical flame of holidays, not the grand display of public ritual, but the steady, ordinary fact of the lamp above the ark. A light kept on as a promise that memory could be practiced. That night, Leah was locking up the synagogue when the eternal lamp did something it had never done in all her years. It blinked once, twice, quickly. Then a longer brightening that made the gold thread in the curtain catch like sunrise. She stood still, keys in hand, listening for the hum of an electrical fault. The lamp did not flicker like failing power. The blinks were too clean, the pauses too exact, the long holds too intentional. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Leah felt the impulse to laugh, an absurd, startled laugh, because in another life she might have been a physicist and she would have said, "That is a signal." Instead, she was a rabbi, and her first thought was, "Our ancestors followed a pillar of fire. Are we being asked to follow again?" Her second thought arrived immediately after, stern and grounding. Do not rush to myth when the world may have a simpler explanation. And still, her eyes stung. She whispered a blessing, not because she was certain, but because she was human, and humans bless what they do not control. The lamp blinked on, off, on, counting in a language made of light. When it ended, she climbed the steps to the Ner Tamid, careful, and found something that unnerved her more than the blinking. The lamp housing was cool to the touch. No heat bloom, no sign of strain, as if the light had been switched not by circuitry, but by a rule the circuitry had politely obeyed. 6. Sikhism, the Khanda. At the Gurdwara gate, the Khanda emblem was heavy metal, solid and familiar, a symbol that lived on the threshold between street and sanctuary. Harjit Singh came late to help clean after langar. He liked the quiet hours when the building felt like a body at rest. Floors washed, pots stacked, the day's voices gone. As he stepped outside, his hand brushed the khanda absent-mindedly, an old habit, like touching your pocket to feel your keys. The metal was warm, not sun-warm, not hands have been on it warm. Warm like it had been holding a current. Then it rang, not a clang, not vibration caused by impact, but a pure, thin note that rose out of the metal itself, as if the emblem had become a tuning fork for something too large to see. The note cut off, returned, held longer, cut off again. Harjit's skin prickled. He pressed his palm fully to the emblem, half expecting to be shocked. Instead, the warmth resolved into pulses beneath his hand, quick pressure, a longer sustained hum. Short, short, long, 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 long. He stepped back, stunned, and the khanda's note faded as if satisfied that someone had received it. Harjit's first instinct was reverence. His second was confusion, because the sound had no melody. It had structure, and structure, he knew, was a kind of speech. That night he dreamed of standing in a field while a giant bell, miles away, tolled without ever being struck. He woke with the sequence in his bones. 7. Shinto, the Kagami. Aiko Nakamura had been taught that the mirror did not show a god. It showed yourself, and in that honest reflection, you might finally notice what the sacred had been trying to tell you all along. The Kagami was kept with care, wrapped and housed behind doors most visitors never saw. It was not for display, it was for presence. That night, a storm pressed against the shrine forest. The trees swayed. Wind hissed through the rope-bound gate. Aiko went to check the inner hall, more from duty than fear. When she opened the door, the mirror was already bright. Not bright like lantern light, bright like sky. But the sky it reflected was not the ceiling, not the room, not even the forest outside. It was a field of stars, sharp, cold points arranged with precision that made her breath stop. Then the stars blinked, not randomly, in clusters, in intervals, short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Aiko staggered back, one hand covering her mouth. Her mind reached for old stories, the sun goddess hiding, the mirror coaxing her out, the world returned to light. But the stars in the mirror were not hers. She could feel it in the way they did not carry any of the constellations she'd grown up tracing. The mirror did not show divinity. It showed elsewhere, and whatever was elsewhere was counting. When the sequence ended, the mirror returned to reflecting the room. Tatami mats, wooden beams, her own pale face. Aiko stared at her reflection and felt for the first time that being seen was not a comfort, it was a fact. 8. Taoism, the Bagua. Master Wei Liang disliked the way people came to temples with shopping lists, health, luck, a sign, a yes. The Tao, he told them, was not a vending machine. It was water. It moved where it moved, and your only wisdom was to move with it. He was sweeping the courtyard when he noticed the Bagua mirror by the gate had gone dull. Then it flashed. Not with sunlight, the sky was pre-dawn grey, but with a sudden crisp reflection, as if the mirror had decided to remember what mirror meant. The trigrams around it, the familiar broken and unbroken lines, seemed to deepen, blacker than black, then lighten again. The effect moved around the circle like a hand on a clock. Tick, tick, hold. Tick, hold, pause. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Wei stopped sweeping. He had seen omens. He had also seen scams. But this felt like neither. This felt like an intelligence that did not care whether he believed. It was not asking for faith. It was demonstrating pattern. Wei raised his eyes to the mountain ridge. To speak, he murmured, you first choose a rhythm, then you choose an ear. The mirror flashed again, patient as rain. When it ended, he did not feel relieved. He felt studied, as if the Tao, which he had always treated as indifferent and vast, had briefly bent down to tap a fingernail against a specific human artifact, just to see if the sound would carry. 9. Zoroastrianism, the sacred fire. Farhad Yazdani had been tending flame long enough to know the difference between drama and devotion. Fire, when honored properly, was not chaotic. It was disciplined. It rose as it rose. It consumed what it consumed. It spoke in crackle and warmth, yes, but it did not perform. So when the temple's fire began to spark in timed bursts, he felt his chest lock. He stood close, careful of his breath as he always was. The flame narrowed, then flared, once, twice, then held in sustained brightness that turned the brass in the room into gold. Then it dimmed to its usual steady life, only to repeat. Short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Farhad's mind leapt to theology. Truth, order, the cosmic struggle against the lie. He wanted the pattern to mean righteousness had arrived like an army. But the flame's timing was too mechanical for metaphor. It was not preaching, it was signaling. He whispered the prayer that steadied his hands, and in the next breath another thought, quiet, unwanted, rose like a second flame. If truth is order, what is more orderly than a message that can cross the world and land in fire? Later, reviewing the security footage, Farhad noticed something that unsettled him. The fire's pulses were synchronized not to any human action in the room, but to something external. It wasn't reacting, it was responding. 10. Jainism, the Ahimsa hand. Meera Patel had always found it strange that the purest symbol in her tradition was also a stop sign. The Ahimsa hand, palm-raised wheel at the center, was not a weapon, not a threat. It was a boundary. Do not harm. Even in thought. She was alone in the temple hall, finishing evening cleaning, when the carved hand above the doorway began to change. Not physically, not in shape, in shadow. The wheel at the palm's center, etched lines radiating outward, caught a light that was not there. The grooves filled with brightness in precise order, like someone tracing them with a fingertip made of moonlight. Two spokes lit quickly. Then a longer arc held, then darkness, then another sequence, short, short, long, short, long, long, long. Meera pressed her palms together, looking up. She did not feel fear. She felt invitation. Because the symbol's meaning was already about restraint, about attention, about choosing not to dominate. And whatever was speaking through the hand was not pushing, it was waiting. Like something that had studied humans and decided the only way to reach them was not through force, but through the places they already treated with care. 11. The listener. How a physicist learns to take holiness seriously. I didn't believe in miracles. I believed in incentives, bias, misinterpretation, faulty wiring, hoaxes, grief, and the human brain's talent for finding faces in clouds. When Anya forwarded me the first clip, cross glows in hospital chapel, I snorted and went back to the spectrum analysis on my second monitor. Then the second arrived. Lamp above synagogue blinks in impossible pattern. Then the third. Prayer wheel turns without wind. Then, mirror shows stars not in our sky. A miracle is easy to dismiss. 10 miracles in 10 unrelated traditions arriving within hours of each other. That's not theology. That's a systems problem. I pulled the raw uploads, not the edited versions. I scraped metadata, normalized time zones, corrected for camera clock drift. I requested original files from witnesses who still had them, before compression smeared the details into soft internet mush. I told myself I was doing it to debunk it faster. The timestamps kept landing on the same point like a needle refusing to move. 3 časa, 71 minuty, 11 sekundi UTC. Not around then, not that night, not near the end of the prayer, the same second. I cross-correlated brightness curves. I ran Fourier transforms on audio when audio existed. I extracted motion vectors from the prayer wheel footage. I compared them to our Chronos clock residuals and to magnetometer data from publicly accessible stations. Everything sang in the same rhythm. The pulse shapes differed, light in one, vibration in another, motion in a third, but the timing scaffolding was identical. Short, short, long/short, long/pause. It reminded me of Morse, but it wasn't any Morse letter. It reminded me of a preamble, a sequence meant not to transmit words, but to establish synchrony. So I did what we always do when language fails. I assumed math. Primes are the universal handshake because primes are not culture. They are not metaphor. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. You can find them without ever meeting a human. I tried mapping short to 1 and long to 0. Then short to 0, long to 1. Then I tried treating the pauses as punctuation rather than data. I tried autocorrelation to see if there was a hidden repetition period. I tried looking for Barker codes, gold codes, things our own satellites used. And that's when the first unsettling thing happened. The pattern wasn't one code. It was the same code, but each site was receiving it at a different phase. Like 10 microphones around a room capturing the same song from different angles, which meant I could do something dangerous. I could stitch it. If I treated each religious object as a different channel and each channel provided a slice, the combined data had redundancy, error correction. That's a design choice. That's not how random cosmic phenomena behave. I sent an email to the Chronos Network listserv with a subject line no scientist should ever write unless they want to be remembered for it. Correlated global transient shows intentional modulation. Request cross-checks. Responses came fast and cautious, like people approaching a wild animal. A metrology lab in Tokyo confirmed a transient in their optical clock at the same moment. A geomagnetic observatory in Finland confirmed a blip. A neutrino detector in Canada reported nothing, but that was expected. Neutrinos are the wrong tool for most ghosts. Then a colleague in Paris, Jean, who had more cynicism than I had caffeine, sent a private message. If this is deliberate, it's using the planet as a detector array, which means it knows us. I stared at the words until I felt something I'd always refused to allow into my work: dread. Because Jean was right about the implication even if he was wrong about the conclusion. The question became, what kind of it can induce a correlated transient in atomic clocks and magnetometers across Earth with modulation that looks like a signal, and then have that same transient express itself as visible phenomena in sacred objects? No existing human technology could do that, not without leaving obvious footprints. Power grid surges, satellite emissions, ionospheric disturbances big enough to make airlines scream. But something had left a footprint, just not in the places we were used to checking. The signal was subtle, elegant, like a whisper delivered through the bones of the universe. I opened a blank notebook and wrote a sentence I would have mocked if anyone else had written it. If an intelligence wanted to be noticed without being feared, it would choose what we already treat gently. That was the first moment I understood why the nodes were sacred. Not because the intelligence cared about our religions, because we do. 12. The world reacts, badly as expected. The first week after the 10 signs, the internet performed its usual sacrament. It turned the unknown into certainty by force. Some called it the end of days. Some called it the beginning of unity. Some called it deepfakes. Some called it an intelligence test and meant that literally, the 10 signs became a weapon everyone could swing. Politicians, pundits, cult leaders, skeptics. Governments that had been pretending faith was quaint suddenly took it seriously when millions of citizens began looking at lamps and mirrors and books as if they might glow. A few extremists vandalized houses of worship in the name of preventing deception. A few opportunists tried to market signal-proof relic boxes lined with copper mesh. A few scientists did what scientists always do when confronted with wonder. They tried to reproduce it in a lab and failed, then declared it wasn't real. I understood the failure. The effects were minute, small enough to ride on the edge of detectability. To see them, you needed two things: a sensitive transducer and a quiet environment, and, apparently, something else. Attention. Not mystical attention, not psychic energy, but the practical kind. Spaces kept dim, clean, stable. Objects maintained with absurd care. Rooms where people had been watching and listening for centuries. High-Q resonators of culture. Sacred objects are protected from casual hands, which means their surfaces and materials can remain consistent for generations. Polished metal, stable varnish, mineral stone kept from weathering, inks protected from UV. If the signal interacted with matter in a way that depended on surface microstructure, on plasmonic resonances in gold leaf, on domain alignment in ferromagnetic inclusions, on piezoelectric stresses in quartz, then sacred objects were perfect detectors. Not because the universe loves religion, because religion loves preservation, but the world didn't want that explanation. It wasn't dramatic enough. People wanted a verdict, God or aliens, blessing or threat. They wanted me to pick a side. I refused. Which is why in the second week I found myself on a video call with a quiet, sharp-eyed woman introduced as Dr. Naila Haddad, UNESCO cultural liaison, who did not waste time on niceties. "We have a problem," she said. I almost laughed. "Only one?" "The phenomena are being politicized," she said, "and weaponized. And worse, claimed. There are groups insisting the signal proves their faith is correct." I pictured the comments I'd seen beneath the videos. The cross proves it. The Qur'an proves it. Shiva proves it. The mirror proves it. Like children fighting over a light that didn't belong to any of them. "What do you want from me?" I asked. "We want you to tell us what it is," she said, and her voice had that calm firmness of someone used to dealing with impossible asks. "And if you can't, we want you to tell us what it isn't." "I can tell you what it isn't," I said. "It isn't random." A pause, then, "Can you prove that?" I looked at the data on my second screen, the graphs that had begun to feel like scripture. Clean timing, correlated across continents, embedded redundancy. "I can prove intent," I said. "I can't yet prove motive." "That will have to do," she replied. "We are convening a private interfaith science panel in Geneva. We want the primary witnesses. We want the objects or close equivalents. And we want you there." I should have said no. I didn't, because somewhere beneath my skepticism there was a human hunger I'd spent a career pretending I didn't have. The desire to know whether the universe could speak back. 13. Invitations and the cost of accepting them. It took diplomacy and discomfort to assemble the 10. Sister Marisol's superior wanted her silent, not because the church feared truth, but because institutions fear being made ridiculous. Marisol came anyway with a crucifix wrapped in plain cloth and a look on her face like she was going to a funeral. Imam Karim consulted elders who argued for hours about whether participating risked sensationalism. He came on one condition: no one touched the Qur'an except him, and no one used it as a prop. The panel agreed. Pandit Anant's temple council demanded assurances the lingam would not be scanned like a museum object. Anant negotiated a compromise. Non-contact sensors only, no physical interference, and a priest present at all times. Tenzin's monastery sent him with a teacher's blessing that sounded like a koan. If the universe is speaking, you don't honor it by shouting back. Rabbi Leah agreed quickly, then spent the next day arguing with herself about whether she was betraying faith by treating a lamp as a detector. Harjit came because his community asked him to, because the Khanda's ringing had frightened some elders who remembered old stories about metals that sing before catastrophe. Aiko came quietly, escorted by a senior priest who watched the world with suspicion the way forests watch axes. Master Wei came smiling, which unnerved everyone more than fear would have. "A river does not refuse to meet the sea," he said, as if this explained everything. Farhad came with a protected ember in a sealed ceremonial lamp, his hand steady in the way only people who tend fire learn to be. Mira came with the ahimsa carving, and her voice shook when she insisted it was not a weapon and would not be used to hurt anyone. And me? I came with hard drives, and with instruments, and with the secret hope that I would discover I'd been wrong about the universe's silence. The Geneva facility was deliberately bland, a neutral space with walls that refused to echo. It looked like a conference center designed by someone who had never enjoyed being alive. We turned one room into an ad hoc lab, photodiodes and high-speed cameras for light transients, fluxgate magnetometers, and a compact atomic magnetometer for field changes. Laser interferometers pointed at reflective surfaces to catch nanometer-scale motion, microphones sensitive into the infrasound range. Environmental sensors for temperature, humidity, pressure, a portable optical frequency comb linked to a strontium reference, because if the constants twitched again, I wanted to catch the twitch in the most honest language physics had. We did all of this without touching the sacred objects with anything invasive, which meant my data would be noisier, messier. But if an intelligence had chosen sacredness as its medium, then disrespect was not just unethical. It might be scientifically stupid. If the receiver depended on the object being treated as sacred, then a lab that treated it like hardware would ruin the coupling. I didn't say that aloud. I just watched Marisol's hands when she set down the crucifix as if it were fragile life. I watched Karim's posture when he placed the Qur'an on its stand, straight-backed, careful, the way you handle not paper but responsibility. I watched Anand touch the lingam's base with a reverence that felt less like worship and more like greeting. I watched the others place their objects as if arranging a conversation. 10 icons in a sterile room. It should have felt absurd. Instead, it felt like we were building an altar for something that did not recognize our categories. 14. The second time. The first event had been singular. A blip. But my stitched reconstruction, the composite signal built from all 10 channels, contained something else at the end. A longer block I had initially dismissed as noise. When I finally treated it as data, it resolved into a timestamp, not in any human format, but in a way that could be derived from physics. A sequence that mapped cleanly onto seconds counted from an epoch defined by a pulsar period. A clock no culture owned. When translated into UTC, it pointed to a moment 7 days after the first event. Trichasa, 17 I една minuti, 11 secundi UTC. Again, an intelligence signal repeating itself is not proof of intelligence. Nature repeats too. Pulses repeat. Metronomes repeat. Mice repeat mistakes. But repeating with that kind of precision, embedded in redundancy across 10 cultural artifacts, that felt like an appointment. So we made one. We began preparing hours before, calibrating sensors, logging background noise, recording baselines. We did it with the seriousness of people who know history is allergic to second chances. As the time approached, the room changed in a way I didn't want to admit. Not physically. Our sensors still read normal, but psychologically. The air felt thicker. 10 people who had each interpreted their sign through the lens of their tradition sat around the table like diplomats in front of a treaty that might rewrite the definition of us. I didn't speak. I watched my strontium line on the monitor and felt my heart begin to match my own short, long breathing pattern, which was ridiculous, and I hated it. Trichasa 17 minuti I 10 secundi. Aiko's hand hovered near the edge of the cloth covering the mirror, as if she wanted to stop herself from looking. Trichasa 17 minuti I 11 secundi. Every graph in my field of view jumped. The clocks shifted. A tiny, synchronized frequency excursion consistent with a transient change in fundamental constants. The magnetometers pulsed. The air pressure sensor registered a micro-oscillation. And then, in the room itself, the nertamid blinked with clean precision. The crucifix's wood grain whispered into brightness. The gilded margin of the Qur'an brightened like sunrise trapped in ink. Condensation formed on the lingam in beads that seemed to remember where to gather. The prayer wheel moved, not spinning wildly, but turning in measured starts. The khanda rang, a thin note that made my molars ache. The sacred ember flared and held, then dimmed in time. The bagua mirror flashed around its trigrams like a clock face. The ahimsa hand's grooves filled with a traveling line of light. The kagami, when Aiko finally lifted the cloth, showed not the room but the same unfamiliar star field, and the stars blinked as if they were nodding. The same pulse, short, long, long. Then something new happened. The pulses did not stop at the pause. They braided. The channels, separate in the first event, began to overlap in time. The pattern thickened, like harmonies stacking atop a melody. Our senses began to show interference, not destructive noise, but constructive structure. The magnetometer trace developed a secondary oscillation. The microphone picked up an infrasound beat that shouldn't exist in a quiet room. And inside my skull, inside everyone's skull, judging by the faces around the table, there was a second voice, not language, a tone, a chord, a sensation of pressure that arrived as if the air had acquired intention. I watched Marisol's lips move in prayer. I watched Kareem's jaw tighten as if he were resisting the urge to speak aloud. I watched Tenzin's eyes soften in recognition rather than fear. I watched Master Wei smile, but it was not a smug smile. It was the expression of someone who had always suspected the universe would eventually reveal itself as stranger than our theories. I did not pray, I did not chant. I did something more revealing. I whispered to no one, "It's real." Then I realized the phrase had been an admission not of physics, but of vulnerability, because what was happening felt intimate, as if the signal had chosen our most guarded objects, not just for protection, but for access, like a visitor using the front door because it wanted to be welcomed. The second stage pattern continued for 19 minutes, then it ended, not abruptly, gently, like a hand withdrawing. The room stayed silent. No one moved for a long time. Finally, Rabbi Leah spoke, voice hoarse. "What does it want?" I stared at the data on the monitors, at the neatly repeating blocks, the redundancy, the appended payload. "It's already told us," I said. "And what did it tell us?" Kareem asked. I swallowed. "It told us where to look," I replied. "And it told us what we are." 15. Decoding the payload. The second stage transmission was larger, denser. The initial pulse, short, long, functioned like a synchronization header, a preamble to align receivers. The next blocks were data. When stitched, the composite stream produced a bit string with enough redundancy to survive missing chunks from any one channel. It was, from a communication standpoint, beautifully conservative. Whoever designed it didn't assume we'd get it right the first time. They assumed we'd be clumsy. That, more than anything, made my throat tighten. Not the mystery, not the grandeur, the patience. I fed the bit stream through every interpretation tool I knew. Treat it as a compressed image. Treat it as a set of coordinates. Treat it as an equation. Treat it as a musical score. Treat it as a key for a cipher. At 4:52, after the room had emptied and only security and a sleepy technician remained, the payload resolved into something I could not unsee. A map, not a geographic map. A sky map. Right ascension and declination, encoded not as human degrees, but as ratios of pulsar periods and hydrogen hyperfine references, units that any species with radio astronomy could, in principle, reconstruct. And attached to the sky position was a time window. Not now, not soon. A date 5 months in the future, a precise hour, and a duration 12 seconds. The cynic in me rose immediately. It's a trap. But traps require a predator and prey. Nothing about the signal felt predatory. It felt like a doorbell rung politely. I ran the coordinates through astronomical catalogues. The sky position landed in an unremarkable patch of darkness between named stars. No famous nebula, no bright pulsar, no obvious candidate, which was either disappointing or clever. If you want to avoid panic, you don't point humanity at a famous star. You point them at nothing and let them discover the something only when it arrives. I drafted a secure memo to the agencies that had been hovering on the edges of the panel like sharks who'd learned to wear suits. I sent it to a short list of observatories and colleagues who could keep their mouths shut long enough to point instruments. Then I did something I hadn't done in years. I went outside. The night air tasted like wet concrete. The city lights washed the sky into a pale haze. I could not see the stars the Kagami had shown. I looked anyway, because looking was the oldest form of prayer humanity had ever practiced. Behind me, in the building, 10 sacred objects sat quietly as if nothing had happened. In my pocket, my phone vibrated with messages from colleagues already guessing what I'd found. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the blank patch of sky, and I wondered how long the universe had been watching us before it decided to knock. 16. The interfaith arguments, and why they mattered to the science. Over the next month we met again and again, sometimes in Geneva, sometimes by encrypted calls, sometimes in long threads of exhausted text that read like theological debates disguised as logistics. The panel fractured along predictable lines. Some wanted to announce everything. Humanity deserves to know, they said, and they were not wrong. Some wanted silence. Humanity will destroy itself over this, they said, and they were also not wrong. Some wanted to claim it. This is proof, they said, and I started losing patience. The most difficult conversations were not the political ones. They were the personal ones. Marisol wrestled with what it meant that a cross had acted like an antenna. If God speaks through physics, she said, does that make it less holy or more? Karim refused to let anyone call it divine, not because he denied divinity, but because he feared arrogance. We must not assume we are being favored, he said. The sign could be a test. Rabbi Leah began reading commentaries on the Ner Tamid that she'd never cared about before. The lamp is supposed to be constant, she told me. Its change feels like an interruption in a promise. Tenzin said the least and watched the most. When asked whether he thought it was alien, he shrugged. Alien to what? He said softly. Everything is alien when you look closely. Anant was troubled by a more practical fear. If this is intelligence, he said, will people come to the temple and demand answers from the stone? They will turn reverence into hunger. Hunger destroys. Farhad worried about fire. People think flame is drama, he said. They don't understand discipline. If they come seeking spectacle, they will burn the wrong things. Mira, quiet until then, said, if this is a message, it chose ahimsa as a door. That must mean something. Aiko spoke once and her words stayed with me. The mirror showed stars that are not ours, but it also taught me something else. It taught me that ours is a story we tell. Master Wei laughed softly. You see, he said to me, even your science has rituals, calibration, baselines, control. You are not as different from us as you think. I should have been offended. I wasn't, because he was right. The science was not separate from the human. It was a way humans disciplined their longing into something measurable. And if the signal was real, then the signal had found a way to ride that longing without being swallowed by it, which suggested the sender understood us at least as well as we understood ourselves. That realization, in a different context, would have been terrifying. In this context, it was oddly comforting, like being met on a bridge rather than pulled into a river. 17. The observation window. 5 months is not long in astronomy, it is long in politics. The closer we got to the observation date, the more pressure mounted. Leaks happened. Not from our core panel. Ironically, the religious representatives were the most disciplined about secrecy, but from orbiting agencies who couldn't resist the seduction of being first to own history. The public learned in fragments that there was a predicted sky event tied to the 10 signs. Cults formed around the coordinates. People bought cheap telescopes and pointed them at the darkness, recording hours of nothing and calling the nothing proof of conspiracy. Meanwhile, the serious work proceeded quietly. Optical telescopes scheduled rapid response time. Radio observatories agreed to monitor the coordinates during the window. A satellite sensor team prepared to watch for unusual gamma or infrared transients. And in my lab, I built something I hadn't expected to build when I got my degree. A reply. Not because I believed in etiquette, but because I believed in protocols. If the signal was designed as a handshake, it might be waiting for acknowledgement. If we wanted more than a single knock, we might have to knock back. But how do you reply to something that uses sacred objects as transducers? You don't emit a radio beam from a dish and hope. You modulate the same channels. We couldn't induce the same physical effect at global scale that would require controlling the same unknown field. But we could do the next best thing, send a signal through the nodes we had. We designed a simple reply protocol, a pattern of actions synchronized to UTC, performed simultaneously by the 10 representatives at their respective sites once they returned home. A bell struck in a specific rhythm. A lamp shuttered. A wheel spun in pulses. A mirror covered and uncovered. A chant voiced in timed syllables. A flame fanned in a controlled sequence. Not as prayer, as modulation. It felt sacrilegious to some and thrilling to others. To me, it felt like engineering. We performed the reply at 3:17:11 UTC one night. 10 people acting in measured synchrony around the globe. Our sensors in the Kronos network recorded no immediate cosmic response. No sudden shift, no obvious return. Jean messaged me, "You really think it's listening?" I stared at the screen. Then I typed, "I don't know, but I know it can hear." Because whether the sender was an extraterrestrial intelligence or something stranger, it had already proven one thing. It knew how to build a receiver out of our world. Surely it could detect our attempt. The observation window approached like a tide, and underneath my excitement there was another feeling I didn't like naming. The fear that what we were doing was not opening a conversation. It was opening a door. 12 seconds of light. On the day of the observation, the sky over Geneva was uncooperative. Clouds like dirty cotton. It didn't matter. Our instruments were elsewhere, on mountain peaks, in deserts, in orbit. We gathered again, not as 10 separate faiths and one scientist, but as a small, exhausted community bound by shared secrecy and shared awe. The time approached. 3:17 minuti I pet secundi UTC. I watched feeds from observatories. Static, noise, darkness. 3:17 minuti, edinadeset secundi UTC. A spike. Not invisible light first, but in radio. A narrow band burst at a frequency that made my breath catch because it sat near a quiet region of spectrum with low natural interference. A clean signal, 12 seconds. Modulated. Not the same short, long pattern this time, more complex. High information density. Like a paragraph after a greeting. Optical telescopes caught a faint point source brightening, not visible to the naked eye but undeniable in the CCD data. Infrared sensors saw a temperature-like signature, as if something had briefly heated the interstellar medium in a confined line. When the 12 seconds ended, the sky returned to darkness. The data, however, did not. It poured into servers, it filled drives, it turned a room of human beings into children staring at a locked chest. We worked in shifts, decoding and checking and rechecking. The signal structure was unmistakably artificial, a preamble designed for synchronization. A payload with error correction, redundancy engineered for noisy channels. Even if you didn't know the meaning, you could recognize the intent. The first layer decoded into numbers. The second layer into a compressed representation of something like an image. When we reconstructed it, the room went silent. Because the image was not of stars, it was not of a planet, it was of Earth. Not a photograph, not a satellite view. A stylized schematic, lines and points and arcs like a geometer's dream. 10 points marked on a sphere, connected, a shape that made my skin crawl, because the 10 points were not random, they were our 10 sites. And the connecting lines formed a figure I recognized from mathematics, not religion, a near-perfect spherical code, points distributed like vertices of a polyhedron. Not exactly an icosahedron, not exactly a dodecahedron, but close enough to be deliberate, an arrangement optimized to sample a field around a sphere. A detector array. Earth had been used as an instrument, and the sacred objects? They were the local antennas at those nodes, chosen because our cultures would keep them stable. I whispered, unable to stop myself. It didn't pick religions. Marisol looked at me sharply. What did it pick? Geometry, I said. Materials, stability, distribution. Kareem's gaze hardened. Then why us? Before I could answer, another layer of the decoded payload revealed itself. a sequence of symbols, abstract, not letters. But the patterns were familiar in a different way. They resembled nothing so much as a phase diagram, transitions between states, a map not of space but of condition, and embedded in that diagram was a simple instruction translated through physics units: cohere. Listen, do not seek source. Source is passing through. The room chilled. Passing through? I turned back to the Chronos data, the clock transient, the planar sweep, the timing differences between nodes, a domain wall, a topological defect. A structure moving through the solar system at galactic velocity. But domain walls aren't intelligent, unless the wall was not a featureless sheet, unless it contained structure, information, computation, a traveling mind. The thought was so absurd my body rejected it with nausea. And yet the data did not care what my body wanted. The signal had shown Earth as a detector array, and it had told us not to look outward for a transmitter. Because the transmitter was not a star, it was the thing moving through our local space, through our planet, through our clocks and lamps and mirrors, through us. Tenzin spoke softly as if finishing a sentence that had begun centuries ago. A visitor does not always come from far away, he said. Sometimes it comes from between. 19. The strange science of the numinous. In the weeks after the 12-second burst, the scientific world fractured into factions that pretended not to be emotional. Some insisted it was an unprecedented natural phenomenon that only appeared artificial because humans had reconstructed it that way. Some insisted it was extraterrestrial technology. Some insisted it was a hoax so advanced it must be extraterrestrial, which is an oddly circular form of denial. We, the panel, became the unwilling center of a storm. But the strangest part wasn't the debates. It was the measurements that continued. After the initial sweep at 3:17:11, the clocks did not fully return to baseline. The drift was tiny, parts in 10 to the power of 18, the kind of thing most physicists would dismiss, but it persisted. And it had a signature. A low-frequency oscillation that matched eerily the infrasound second voice we'd felt in Geneva. A colleague in Sydney sent me a note. Their atom interferometer had begun to show anomalous phase noise at the same frequency. A team in California reported that their superconducting gravimeter saw microvariations aligned with Earth's rotation. It was as if the passing structure had left a wake, not in water, but in the vacuum, which led to an idea too speculative for journals and too precise for superstition. What if the domain wall wasn't just passing through matter? What if it was coupling to information, not mystical information, physical information, correlations, coherence, ordered states? Sacred objects are not just culturally meaningful. They are often physically ordered in ways everyday objects are not. Gold leaf laid in careful sheets, polished mirrors with controlled curvature, metals hammered and annealed for resonance, stones kept cool and clean, flames tended and shielded, books preserved in stable humidity. Ritual is, among other things, a practice of maintaining low entropy in a small corner of a messy world. If the passing structure interacted more strongly with ordered systems, high coherence, high stability, then sacred objects would glow like tuning forks in a field everyone else ignored. And if it interacted with coherence, then it might also interact with brains. I didn't want to go there. Brain research attracts nonsense the way light attracts moths. But we had evidence we couldn't ignore. During the second stage transmission in Geneva, 10 people had reported the same sensation, a pressure tone, a non-sound. We hadn't instrumented our bodies out of respect, out of caution, out of the assumption that physics happened out there. Now, regretting that assumption, we did something uncomfortable. We asked volunteers across cultures, across beliefs, to wear EEG headbands and heart rate monitors during a third synchronized listening session at their sacred sites. Not because we thought minds caused the signal, because we suspected minds were part of the receiver. At 3:17:11, the results came back. Across thousands of participants, there was a subtle but statistically undeniable uptick in phase synchrony, a momentary alignment of oscillatory brain activity in the theta range, like a wave of coordinated attention. Heart rate variability shifted in tandem. It was small, easy to dismiss, except it matched the same timing and the same frequency signature we saw in clocks and magnetometers. The passing structure had touched biology. It had touched attention itself. It had used sacred objects, not just because they were stable, but because they were surrounded by minds trained to listen. When I presented this to the panel, silence followed. Then Mira spoke, voice quiet. "In Jane's stories," she said, "the universe is full of living beings too small to see. We are taught to respect them, even when we don't understand them." She looked at me. "What if what's passing through is alive in a way our categories cannot hold?" I wanted to answer like a physicist. Instead, I answered like a human. "Then we're not having first contact with a civilization," I said. "We're having first contact with a kind of life we didn't know was possible." Kareem's eyes narrowed. "And what does it want?" I looked at the decoded instruction again. Cohere. Listen. "I think," I said slowly, "it wants us to become coherent enough to hear the rest." 20. What it portends, and why that's the most dangerous part. We are addicted to portents. Humans see patterns and ask what they mean because meaning is how we survive pain. But the universe is not obligated to provide narrative. This time it had, or something had, using the universe's bones. If the passing structure was intelligent, its presence implied physics is porous. There are fields and structures in reality we've treated as background. Some of them may carry information. The cosmos may be full of messages that are not broadcasts. They are travelers, threads, defects, waves. Religion is not irrelevant to contact, not because the intelligence respects doctrine, but because doctrine creates stable attention. Ritual creates order. Sacredness creates preservation. Those are physical conditions that can be exploited. Human unity is not a moral ideal, but a technical requirement. The message was split. No one tradition could decode it alone. No one discipline could decode it alone. The receiver was humanity in cooperation. That last point had consequences. Because if coherence was required, then division was vulnerability. Already factions argued that the panel should not exist, that their tradition should control the objects, that science was stealing holiness, that holiness was stealing science. People fought, as humans always do, over who got to be the interpreter of the divine or the alien. But the signal had avoided giving any group ownership. It had chosen 10 doors at once, forcing the world to confront an uncomfortable fact. Meaning is not private property. And now, with the persistent drift in the clocks and the subtle synchrony in the brains, another possibility emerged, one I didn't want to say out loud. If the passing structure coupled to coherence, then it might amplify coherence. It might simply by existing push humanity towards synchronization the way a metronome on a shared platform slowly forces other metronomes to fall into step. And if you've ever watched that experiment, you know the unsettling part. No one metronome chooses, they just align. A cosmic intelligence that could nudge coherence could, in theory, nudge more than attention. It could nudge behavior, ethics, faith, war, peace. It could become, accidentally or intentionally, a new kind of actor in human history, one that didn't speak in words but in the tuning of our collective nervous system. That would be salvation to some, violation to others. To me, it was an unanswerable question framed as a fear. If something can tune us, are we still ourselves? The panel struggled with that. The scientists, too. We had wanted first contact to be a message we could translate and file. We had not expected first contact to be something that might be inside our translation process. 21. The twist, or the 11th sign. Months later, after the press conferences and the denials and the careful papers written in cautious language, the 10 signs became history's new contested relic. People built museums around the idea, people built sects, people built careers. The Kronos network continued monitoring. We detected additional sweeps, fainter, intermittent, as if the passing structure had thickness, layers like weather fronts in a cosmic atmosphere. The sacred objects continued to respond occasionally, always at times we could predict based on the clock drift patterns. I told myself we were learning, that we were building understanding. Then, one night, alone in my lab, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My own strontium clock, shielded, isolated, protected by science's rituals, showed a micro-oscillation that matched the old preamble. Short, short, long. I thought it was noise. I checked cables, I checked power, I checked temperature, I checked for cosmic ray hits on the photodiodes. The pattern repeated, short, short, long, short, long, long, long. And in the reflection of a stainless steel cabinet door, I saw something that made my breath stop, a faint star field, not the lab behind me, not my own face. A scatter of unfamiliar points, arranged with the same precise coldness Aiko had described. I stared until my eyes watered. The stars blinked, the same pulse. My hands went numb because the cabinet door was not sacred. It was not ancient. No one had prayed before it. It was just metal, which meant one of two things. Either the intelligence had stopped caring about sacredness, or sacredness had never been about the object. It had been about the observer. I turned slowly, as if movement might break something invisible. On the desk, beneath a stack of papers, lay the one thing in my lab that was not calibrated, not measured, not part of my professional persona, a small, worn rosary. It had belonged to my mother. I had not touched it in years. I kept it not out of faith, but out of guilt, the kind that clings even when belief does not. I picked it up. The beads were warm, not room warm, warm like Harjit had described. And when my fingers closed around it, the second voice arrived, not in the air, but inside my skull, clearer than it had ever been in Geneva. A tone that felt like pressure, a chord that felt like meaning without language. Then, in my mind, not as sound, not as words, but as a certainty shaped like a sentence, I understood something that the payload image of Earth had only hinted at. The 10 sacred objects were not merely detectors, they were training wheels. A way for the intelligence to introduce itself through culturally safe doors, to teach us the rhythm of listening. The real receiver was always going to be the same thing it had always been: human attention, human coherence, human nervous systems capable of entrainment. We had called it prayer, meditation, ritual, awe. We had built whole religions around the practice of aligning ourselves to something unseen. The intelligence hadn't invented that, it had recognized it. And now, having established a protocol through our holiest icons, it was moving on to the next stage. Direct coupling, not through relics, through us. My breath came fast. I set the rosary down as if it were dangerous. On my monitor, the clock residuals formed a clean, repeating wave. In the cabinet reflection, the star field held steady. Then the stars blinked in a new pattern, not short, short, long, something longer, more complex, like a paragraph after a greeting. I reached for my recorder with shaking hands and hit log. And as I did, another understanding landed with the quiet terror of a final twist. The 12-second skyburst had not been the sender's voice at full bandwidth. It had been the sign that the passing structure had recognized our response. A confirmation that we had become coherent enough to be noticed, which meant the 10 signs were not the beginning of contact. They were the beginning of initiation. The message was not merely hello. The message was learn to listen. And the strangest part, stranger than aliens, stranger than dark matter minds, stranger than sacred objects as antennas, was this: we were already built to do it. We always had been. Religions, for all their differences, were not just systems of belief. They were systems of coherence, and something in the universe had finally found a way to use that coherence as a channel. I stared at the star field in the cabinet door and felt for the first time that the word extraterrestrial was too small, because what was looking back at me did not feel like a visitor from another planet. It felt like a visitor from another layer of reality, one that had always been here, threaded through our matter, waiting for our minds to become quiet enough to hear the rhythm in the dark. The stars blinked again, and this time, in the silence between pulses, I realized I was no longer sure whether I was observing a signal or being tuned into one. Epilogue: 10 signs, one voice, and the question we couldn't ask before. We convened again, the panel, after my lab incident, because I told them, because science is useless if it becomes a private religion. Aiko listened to my description of the star field in a cabinet door and did not look surprised. "It's spreading," she said softly. "Or we are." Karim closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that sounded to my ears like steadiness rather than fear. Marisol held her crucifix and said, "If it can use anything, then the sacredness was never in the object." Mira nodded. "The sacredness," she said, "was in the vow not to harm what we don't understand." Tenzin smiled faintly. "The training wheels come off," he said. Master Wei's gaze was distant. "You asked what it portends," he murmured. "It portends that your categories are about to fail, and that is not a tragedy. It is a beginning." I wanted to ask the only question that mattered: can we refuse? But I didn't. Because I realized, with a chill, that it was not even clear what refusal would mean. How do you refuse a structure that passes through your planet like weather? How do you refuse a tuning that might already be happening in the background of your own thoughts? How do you refuse a conversation when the receiver is your capacity to listen? We ended that meeting without resolution. We ended with more data, more awe, more dread, more humility. We ended, in other words, like humans confronted with the genuinely unknown. And somewhere out there, or in here between particles and prayers and clocks, the passing intelligence continued on its path through space, leaving behind a wake of coherence and questions. 10 signs, one voice, and a twist we were only beginning to understand. It had never needed our objects. It had needed our listening. And now that we had learned the rhythm, it was going to speak through everything, including us.